3 weeks after protesters first set up an encampment in Harvard Yard to call for a ceasefire in Gaza and to demand that the university divest from Israel, students voluntarily removed their tents today. Organizers agreed to take it all down after negotiations with university officials, who agreed on their part to meet with protesters to discuss the endowment and to quickly process petitions for suspended students to be reinstated. So what is next for Harvard and the student protest movement overall as the school year draws to a close? GBH News' Tori Bedford was there as protesters dismantled the encampment, and she joins me now. Hey, Tori. Hey. So the end of the encampment at Harvard was different than what we've seen at other institutions in the Boston area. Why do you think this particular encampment ended the way it did?
Well, it's interesting if you look at where these schools are located, right? Boston is such a college town, and we have all of these different campuses all across the city. But Emerson was one of the first ones to be cleared, and the police there actually read out the city ordinance, which bans tents, and they were in kind of a public thoroughfare. They were on a city street. And so that was what was cited as the justification for bringing in police. And that one kind of stands out on its own in that way. Harvard, MIT, all these other places, they're private camps, private campuses, they have their own, but Harvard Yard is also gated in. And what Harvard has been doing is checking IDs. They can close and lock all of the gates and have security officers from the campus come out and check. And so I think that because they had that control and have maintained that control from the beginning, maybe that was a factor. I don't really know how each of these schools are making these decisions. Right.
We don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but those are big differences that are worth highlighting. Is it also possible that Harvard was savvier, and I'm not saying that to endorse what they did, but just in terms of the efficacy of what they did, when it came to starting to mete out discipline in connection with the encampments, because they were suspending students, right? They were evicting them from student-owned housing, barring them from exams and commencement. And if I recall correctly, tell me if I'm wrong, they started doing that late last week, right?
These universities hire and are run by a lot of very savvy people, well-educated, well-paid professionals. I'm thinking of Brown University, where students had declared victory, but what they won, was that in October the board will vote on divestment, and they could still vote no. But that was the sort of concession that was made. Here there were some concessions that were made, and it's still not fully in agreement towards the divestment that students were asking for. I think you're talking about the suspensions. It's interesting because I'm not sure how they were going about figuring out who was involved in the encampment. Recently, we heard that a Harvard Crimson reporter, a student journalist, was issued a suspension that was immediately, revoked. Right. But it kind of brings into question how they were determining who was a part of the protest and of the encampment. They were, giving out, they have, I think, more than 20 students right now who have been suspended. The interim president, Alan Garber, just said that he would go back and reinstate those students and sort of take a step back on the other disciplinary actions that were sent out to the 60-some students.
Wrap them up as quickly as possible.
Yeah, but when you think about these universities kind of taking a step back and really figuring out how to make this work for them, it is it's simple on one hand, but it's also very complex when you're thinking about managing an endowment and how those endowments might be indirectly invested in certain funds.
Well, that brings me to my next question, so nicely done. Anytime a guest does that, it's terrific. As you know, what are the concessions that the students got from the administration, and how might they affect this divestiture push moving forward?
So the university agreed to meet with students and the shareholders who operate, the endowment. It's, I think, the biggest endowment, university endowment in the country.
Yeah, it's more money than many countries, I believe.
Billion? I don't know.
It's in the billions.
Yeah, it's $50 billion. Yeah, it's a lot.
It's a lot of money.
And to kind of have discussions with students, those discussions will be student-led. So they'll get to come in and talk about why they should divest from XYZ. They'll also be talking about setting up a Center for Palestine Studies at the university.
Oh, that's interesting.
There's already been some funding set aside for that, so that was one of the concessions. And then, going and reinstating the students who were suspended and kind of looking at making sure that students are not facing specific disciplinary action for their involvement in the encampment.
I saw a Twitter thread from one of the groups that was involved with the encampment that kind of scoffed at these concessions that you just outlined, basically saying this is the administration just, trying to get us to pipe down and be quiet. We don't attach a ton of meaning to these things that they've offered us. Is that representative, or were there people who you spoke with who are pleased by these concessions?
Well, I think that's why I compared it to Brown, right? Because it's not the purpose, it's not the demands, right, that were met. I spoke to a student today who was suspended, so they asked to remain anonymous because they're afraid of future retaliation. Basically, it was saying that organizers at the encampment, they don't see it as a total win.
Okay, I think we've actually got video of the student who you spoke with, so let's take a look and hear it in her own voice.
All of these things, the campaign for divestment, the movement for Palestinian liberation, they didn't start with the encampment. They won't end with it. They certainly won't end with this deal. And we just have hope that, you know, in addition to these conversations, kind of the community support and organizing power that we saw with this encampment will continue to put pressure on Garber to actually push the needle on divestment and disclosure.
That last comment of hers gets to a big question that I've got for you, since you've been watching this stuff so closely. What's going to happen to this movement, not just at Harvard, but in the Boston area, across the country, now that the school year has wrapped up, because schools were so much epicenters of the protest movement? What do you foresee?
I actually asked that to a Northeastern student who told me that there are a lot of local students at the school, and he doesn't expect it to be, he said, I wouldn't expect a quiet summer. I think a lot of these discussions will be ongoing, and I think that when the students come back in the fall, particularly at universities like Harvard and Brown, where they have a promise, you know, to meet with deans and heads of the school and people leading the endowment, I think that they plan to continue this push. You know, at each individual encampment, they were all pushing for divestment, transparency, but that looks different in different places.
Right.
And so I think that this student who we just played the video was saying that, you know, these are small wins in a way, and she said it pushes the needle. I do think that it is having an impact, you know, around the world for people to see this. I think that it has put a lot of pressure on these institutions, which are extraordinarily powerful, and I don't know what we're going to see over the summer. I know a lot of kids will go home. You know, a lot of people will be kind of figuring out how the school has disciplined. It's so different in each case at this point, based on the decisions that the school leaders have made. But I think that they are really radicalized about this, and a lot of them are 18, 19 years old, and so this is something that I think is really formative, right? This person is a social studies major and was saying this is, like, you know, students have been criticized for saying, for going out and doing this instead of focusing on finals or focusing on their studies, and she was like, this is the work. This is what I am learning about.
And you mentioned people coming back in the fall, promises that have been made by institutions to engage in discussions, that sort of thing. Asking you to speculate here, but if the war in Gaza were to wrap up before then, would you anticipate this push would continue?
I think we've seen endowments at some universities, you know, move away to divest from things like fossil fuels.
Yep.
And so looking at that history, there's a possibility that there will continue to be a push for some of these endowments, you know, not to receive funding or to give funding or be involved so much and have these relationships with military institutions.
And as you mentioned, that is such a complicated thing, like the web of connections that might need to be untangled.
But it is possible,
Yep.
because some universities have done it when it comes to issues of climate change, which is also important to a lot of people of every generation, but particularly this generation who has been given this world that, you know, is falling apart.
On that note, Tori Bedford, good to talk to you as always. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you.